Hello, my name is Jim Hadley, and at the beginning of each of these 10-part programs, I'd like to just give you a little bit of an idea about the point of view from which I approach the subject matter. Museums like this display what are called, in the most general sense, works of art. But what gives a work of art its value? Why do we put it in a place like this? If you're familiar with the typical art history text, you've been led to believe that what's most important, what's most valuable about a work of art is what it looks like. Art historians try to convince us of this by talking above all else about things like dramatic intersecting diagonals, monumental groupings, lines, forms, and so on. Sometimes this kind of language can be pretty far from useful, however. Take this example from Bruce Cole and Adelheid Galt's book, Art of the Western World. Rationality and irrationality are woven together as line defines volume here and denies its existence there, as gold implies space in one spot and affirms a flat surface in another. Irreconcilable differences somehow coexist here. Would you say that this description fits this picture? Sounds like it could to me, but in fact, it's a description of this 14th century enunciation by Simone Martini. Maybe this is a little unfair of me, but only a little. I can just imagine Bruce Cole or, say, Kenneth Baker trying to describe a man who'd robbed him to the police. They'd never catch the guy. But the real point I want to make isn't that the language of art historians is often more likely to produce puzzlement or laughter than insight. The point I want to make is rather simply just that this kind of language leads us to concentrate on appearances. This is a problem because when art historians leave their books, as it were, and come out in the real world, it sometimes seems as though what a work of art looks like counts for almost nothing at all. For example, the New York Metropolitan Museum used to have what was supposed to be an ancient Egyptian bronze cat on display. It was one of the most popular items in the museum until it was discovered to be a forgery and immediately removed. Not because of anything connected with its appearance, but because it was made using a technique unknown to ancient Egyptian artists. The Rembrandt Research Committee is currently providing many relevant examples of this sort of thing. These fellows are trying to establish which alleged Rembrandts are actual Rembrandts. The Berlin Museum's Man with a Golden Helmet here is one of the relatively few well-known pictures formerly attributed to Rembrandt to be reattributed by them, and it is one of the relatively few quantum Rembrandts, whether well-known or not, still on display, although it too has been demoted from what Steve Martin calls Rembrandt wow to Rembrandt yeah right. Of the 12 alleged Rembrandts, for example, that the RRC says are not Rembrandts in the Washington National Gallery, only one is still on display at all, yet not one looks any different than it did before the RRC's investigations. We didn't see any headlines that read, say, Rembrandt found with diagonals that no longer intersect. Copies of Dürer engravings, indistinguishable from the original to the naked eye, are available to anyone with a nickel for a Xerox machine, while the originals are valued as great works of art. How can this be explained if the appearance of a work of art is the main thing that makes it valuable to us? What these kinds of cases illustrate is that there is a radical inconsistency in the way art historians do business. What is valuable about a work of art is obviously something much more complex than just what it looks like. We don't have time to go into this in a lot of detail here, but I think the most important factor determining the value of works of art, at least of the sort that get into art history texts, is what we might call their evocative power. Consider this case. Suppose you have a picture on your desk which you think is a portrait of you drawn by your daughter when she was 6. And then one day your now grown daughter comes in and says, Dad, I have a confession to make. You know that picture on your desk that you think is a portrait of you by me at the age of 6? Well, Dad, I didn't draw that. Remember little Betty Kowalski down the street? She drew it, and it's not you at all, Dad. It's supposed to be Paul McCartney. You might still keep the picture around, put it in the bottom drawer of your desk, sort of your equivalent to the depot where the Washington National Gallery stores its pseudo-Rembrandts, but your attitude to it has changed entirely. Not because anything about its appearance has changed, but because its evocative power has changed. Now, to an art historian, Rembrandt is practically like a member of his own family, and when something thought to represent him is found to be false, this changes his whole attitude to the work, regardless of the fact it still looks the same. But for the evocative power of works of art to affect us, for them to serve as the exalted souvenirs of the whole cultural context out of which they come, we have to be familiar with those contexts. We need to know about their subjects, the subjects of the works of art, and about religion, politics, the other arts like literature and music, the whole cultural package, if works of art are going to be anything more than collections of dramatic intersecting diagonals and monumental groupings, lines defining volume and colors implying space in one spot and a flat surface in another. This way of approaching the history of art tends to blur the distinction between works of art and historical artifacts, as they might be called, between things like, say, the Mona Lisa and things like, to take an extreme case, Napoleon's toothbrush on display in the Carnavalet Museum in Paris. And different as the interest we take in the one may seem from the interest we take in the other, in this pair of extreme examples, their value to us comes ultimately from a common source, their evocative power. In fact, almost anything old enough or evocative enough comes to be treated like a work of art, whether it was meant to be one or not. In the end, and I think this is an important point, history itself comes to take on much the quality of a work of art, in which we judge events not so much by moral standards, but by whether or not they are interesting or enlightening or moving. A sort of corollary to this is that something that didn't happen, like the Trojan War, can have much more importance than lots of things that really did happen, and Odysseus and Hamlet can be as important as Henry VIII and Napoleon. This may also seem like a rather extreme position at this point, but I think what I mean will eventually be both clear and persuasive if you stick with these lectures long enough. The general purpose of the lectures, then, is just to tell enough of the story of the Euro-Mediterranean chapter of this whole unfaded and substantial pageant that is sometimes called the history of civilization, to allow us to increase our appreciation of the value of the souvenirs of it that we have, whether they are works of art, music, literature, battlefields, buildings, tombs, or toothbrushes. Eh bien, mes amis, à l'affaire. So now that you've been introduced to the whole six-quarter series, I want to give you just a little preview of what we'll be doing specifically this quarter. We'll be covering the period from more or less the 11th century to the 16th, and I think that justifies calling this quarter the Italian Renaissance, although for the first couple of weeks we'll still be in the late Middle Ages. And that means that the most memorable things we'll see for a while are going to be buildings, and primarily Christian buildings like the Cathedral of Pisa here. This is the Ducal Palace in Urbino now. As we get farther into the Renaissance proper, we'll see more and more secular buildings as well. The Renaissance is, of course, a much more secular period than the Middle Ages, and this is something that will manifest itself in all the arts. This palace is, in fact, one of Kenneth Clark's favorite places, and he says it's the only palace in which he can walk around without feeling oppressed and exhausted. And it was the home of one of the great men of the Renaissance, too, about whom we'll hear a lot, Federico da Montefeltro, statesman, soldier, art patron, book collector, a real Renaissance man, and in fact called the perfect man by his biographer, the Florentine Marsilio Ficino. The Renaissance is not a great age for Italian literature unless you want to say the Renaissance began in the 14th century, which you could justify, I think. In any case, the greatest literary geniuses we'll hear about this quarter all belong to that century: Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. And this is the portrait of Dante attributed to Giotto in the Bargello Chapel in Florence. He's, of course, the author of the Divine Comedy, the single greatest work in Italian literature, which is, as someone has said, praised by everyone and read by no one. But to someone who knows Dante's age well, and will come to know it pretty well, there is no more impressive and evocative accomplishment. Just as the Italian Renaissance, at least from 1400 on, is not known for its literature, it's not known for its music, at least not music by native Italians anyway. The 14th century organist Francesco Landini, whose tomb you see now, is the most important composer whose music we'll hear, and who was actually born in Italy until we get to the 16th century. Most of the famous composers of the Italian Renaissance, Guillaume Dufay, Josquin des Prez, Heinrich Isaac, as you can tell by their names, were born elsewhere. What the Renaissance is really famous for is, of course, the visual arts, and some say the Renaissance in the narrow sense began with Ghiberti's doors for the baptistry of the Cathedral of Florence, a project that culminated with the Gates of Paradise here, which Vasari, who had seen all the great work of the Renaissance and was one of Michelangelo's own best friends, called the finest masterpiece ever created. He may have meant of this sort, but in any case, Michelangelo's own accomplishments as a sculptor, David, the Pietà, the Moses, are now usually put at the top in the history of their art form by most well-known judges, and we'll hear all about them, of course. Despite the accomplishments of architecture and sculpture, literature and music in the Renaissance, the art form most people think of first in association with this period is painting. And a lot of authorities say that Giotto's 14th century Arena Chapel fresco cycle is the greatest accomplishment in at least the early history of painting in the Renaissance, and fresco is in fact the medium in which most of the greatest painters of the Renaissance did their greatest work. And while he may not be as well known as Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo, you should be prepared to like Giotto. There's hardly been a bad thing said about him in the entire history of art criticism. Michelangelo's own Sistine Chapel, which you see now, is the climactic accomplishment of Renaissance painting, and we'll spend a lot of time in here. Goethe says that you can have no idea of what one man can accomplish until you've seen this. Michelangelo had never painted a fresco on commission in his life, and on his first try he painted the greatest one ever. But what made the Renaissance was that there were so many other geniuses around as well, and while Michelangelo was painting the Pope's chapel, Raphael was painting in his palace, and this is his school of Athens. I've referred to the relative secularity of the Renaissance, and here you have a standout example of that. Here on the wall of the Pope's own office is a picture with hardly a Christian in it. There could hardly be a more dramatic illustration of the Church's attempt to make classical heroes at least honorary Christians. There are too many great artists to mention them all in this introduction, but Leonardo can just represent panel painting here, and Italian Renaissance science as well. In addition to being unsurpassed as a painter in oil, he was also the most relentlessly curious man, as Kenneth Clark calls him, in history. His notebooks are filled with studies of everything from astronomy to zoology, military science to botany, anatomy to airplanes, helicopters, submarines, and bicycles. Had he been born in the 17th century instead of the 15th, had he had contemporaries like Newton and Descartes and Leibniz with whom he could have exchanged information, the Battle of Waterloo might have been fought with tanks and machine guns. We'll wind up in Venice, which Italians today still regard as almost a foreign country. It's probably the most idiosyncratic city of its size in the world. A lot of poetic things have been said about its charm. I think Proust's claim that when he visited Venice, his dream became his address is one of the best. The last lecture of the quarter will be devoted to the Renaissance here, and we'll see San Marco and the Doge's Palace and hear about the great age of Venetian painting in the 16th century, represented by people like Titian and Tintoretto. Okay, that's enough for the preface and table of contents, and now we'll move right on to page 1. The greatness of Italy's overall contribution to European civilization is not a matter for argument. The influence of Rome affects our lives every day in 100 ways, and some would say that just one Italian city, Florence, has produced the greatest poet, the greatest painter, greatest architect, greatest sculptor, and greatest all-around genius in European, some would say world, history. Nevertheless, the Dark Ages in Italy were as dark as just about anywhere else in Europe. For the period from the late 6th century to the early 11th century, we have very few buildings still standing, and most of the sculpture and painting which survives could be put in this classroom. There are fine things like reliquaries and other sorts of church furniture, but these are the products of the jeweler and the craftsman, who are not usually classed with the painter and the sculptor. Though the Renaissance is not usually said to begin until 1400 or so, the late 11th and early 12th centuries saw a very obvious creative upsurge of their own. The amount of surviving fine art from the period roughly 1050 to 1200 must be on the order of at least several hundred times greater than the amount for the preceding 5 centuries combined. Though this is, of course, a difficult kind of thing to measure. This upsurge is part of a continent-wide movement which we discussed north of the Alps last quarter. We can point out and emphasize the effects of this movement, i.e. the works of art, much more easily than we can persuasively determine the cause of it. Indeed, what counts as an effect and what counts as a cause in the analysis of historical phenomena is itself by no means always clear. It is often said, of course, that prosperity is one of the chief causes of phenomena like the Renaissance, but Genoa, once the greatest and most prosperous of the Italian maritime republics, is now remembered for only 2 cultural contributions: Columbus and the dye which the French called bleu de jean, which we used to dye blue jeans. Bleu de jean, blue jeans. Culturally, Genoa fell wholly, though, in the shadow of its rivals, Pisa and Venice. What about Florence? It's more prosperous today than it was in the Renaissance, but can you name a single Florentine artist now working? What about Orinda? Anyone in Orinda going to be thought a genius in 500 years? It's like Orson Welles says in The Third Man. Look at the Swiss. They've been the most prosperous people in Europe for 500 years, and what have they contributed to civilization? The cuckoo clock. This is a complex issue. But the bottom line is that to have great art, you need great artists. No genius is no art, and no other enduring contributions either. There are currently 252 government programs to which California artists have access, offering all sorts of grants and support, but you can't get art out of turnips no matter how much you pay them. In the 11th century, Pisa and Venice had some great builders and artists, and there are perhaps no finer buildings in Italy than the cathedrals of those cities, both begun in the 1060s, when the Dark Ages were coming to an end, and the Renaissance could almost be seen on the horizon. We'll postpone a look at Venice until we treat that city's contributions as a whole, and begin our quick advance to the Renaissance in Pisa. The most ambitious building undertaken in Italy since the fall of Rome, the Cathedral of Pisa, which you see now from the air, was begun about 1065, in part in celebration of a victory by the Pisan fleet over the Arabs off the coast of Sicily. Edward Hutton calls it perhaps the most wonderful church in all Italy. Those of you who remember Gregory VII and the Emperor Henry IV from last quarter will be interested to note that one of the few things on which they agreed was the greatness of this building, to which they both contributed substantial donations. Like many Italian cathedral complexes, and unlike most cathedrals north of the Alps, it features a separate baptistry and a detached bell tower, or campanile. In this case, the campanile has become the most famous part of the whole program, and we'll hear more about it in a few minutes. This cathedral, which you see now from the west, is often said to be the first great Romanesque building in Italy. To say that something is Romanesque is to say that it owes much to ancient Roman precedents. As the word is in fact usually used by art historians, however, it refers to virtually all architecture of the 11th century and most of what was built in the 12th. It is also a word applied to the sculpture of the period and sometimes to the painting, but little of the latter survives. This is so despite the fact, this use of the term Romanesque to describe the sculpture and painting of the period, this is so despite the fact that there's nothing Roman about them at all. The round arch is considered to be the most obvious architectural feature exhibited by Romanesque buildings. The Cathedral of Pisa's especially Italian Romanesqueness, its Roman-likeness, is also seen in the extravagant use of columns, most of which were in fact taken from ancient Roman buildings. The facade of the church, which was not finished until well into the 12th century, is solid marble, as is pretty much the whole building. I imagine one would have to go all the way back to at least the 5th century to find evidence for a more impressive building entirely of marble like this in Italy. Most late imperial buildings were brick rather than marble. The ground plan, based on the Latin cross in the manner of most early churches in the 5th and 6th centuries, will now become the clear favorite for hundreds of years to come. Here's a better view of the facade. We know the names of the architects of this building, Buscatus and Ronaldus. The former is in fact buried in the facade of the church under the arch at the far left. But architects as a group are among the least well-known figures in the category of great artists. Part of the problem is perhaps just that medieval buildings often took centuries to complete, and so credit became sort of diffused. But even today, architects are rarely as well known as painters, writers, or musicians. It's sometimes suggested that medieval craftsmen, architects, builders, sculptors were more self-effacing than later, more media-savvy ones. They were working, just for the glory of God. But in fact, there are a lot of signed works of medieval art. And having himself buried in the facade of his church doesn't argue for modesty in the character of Buscatus, anyway. This is the east end, or apse, of the Cathedral of Pisa now. It's sometimes suggested that one of the most important things about the Renaissance was the development of large cities, and many cities were, at least in Italy, Flanders, and to some extent in Germany, virtual city-states on the model of ancient Athens. The Pisan and the Venetians certainly didn't consider that they were fellow citizens of a country called Italy, except in the most superficial sense. It's been argued that these small political entities encouraged greater pride and loyalty, and that they brought out the best in their citizens who had a feeling that what they did really mattered on that scale, whereas the giant states of later history of the 20th century produce a much more diffuse sense of loyalty and a feeling that what one person does can hardly matter at all. Certainly a lot of places we think of as city-states, Athens, Florence, Bruges, and so on, have produced more in the arts than a whole lot of countries with populations 100 or 1,000 times what these cities had in their creative primes. The population of Pisa when this was built was probably no more than 10,000 or so, and virtually everyone in the city must have been involved in one way or another in the building of their cathedral. Everyone in the city could take pride in this communal accomplishment in a way it's difficult to find an analogy for in, say, 20th century America. Gloria in excelsis Deo. Here you see the inside of the church looking east now. Everyone knows about the Leaning Tower, and therefore something at least about Pisa's importance in the history of architecture. But in the late Middle Ages, it was a center of production in all the arts. As we'll see later, The earliest significant panel paintings in Italy came from Pisa, many of them anyway. Many of the first great sculptors in the history of the late medieval period, high Middle Ages, or early Renaissance, whatever you want to call a period from around the 11th to the 14th centuries, also came from or did work in Pisa. Giovanni Pisano made the pulpit, which you can see on the north side of the nave. And around 1300, the greatest painter of the day, Cimabue, designed the mosaic depicting the Almighty, the Pantocrator, in the East End. John White, in his big book on the art of Italy in the late Middle Ages, calls Pisa the great port of entry for Byzantine influence into Italy. And this mosaic certainly does, as you see it up more closely now, look like an example of it, although I think at least most of the surviving examples of this subject on such a monumental scale are actually either in Italy or Sicily, not in the Greek East. We'll see the famous one at Monreale near Palermo after the break. While we see some more of Pisa now, we'll hear a piece of Gregorian plain chant. Last quarter we got all the way up to 13th century polyphony, so this will be a bit of a step backward in the history of music for some of you, but for the rest, this will give you something with which to compare the polyphony that's to come. What we'll hear is the introit for Pentecost. Now you're looking through the transept at the Cathedral of Pisa. The striation, the alternation of black and white marble, is of a sort found all over Europe in buildings of this age. And it's often thought to be a result of Moorish influence, but this is a difficult thing to know about. As I mentioned last quarter, some think it's Visigothic in origin. This is the nave wall. And looking back toward the west end of the church, the entrance. Here's a detail from the decoration of that wall that you can hardly see from the level of the floor. One thing that sometimes suggests the presence of genius is the amount of trouble taken to make perfect even things that can hardly be seen, like this detail of the inner facade. Here you see the baptistry now. Italian Romanesque churches often have a baptistry, well, usually have a baptistry separate from the church, and such is the case in Pisa, where we can see one of the finest. It was thought necessary in Italy to have the baptistry outside the church because it was thought improper for the unbaptized to enter into the house of the Lord, a view which was not shared by those north of the Alps where freestanding baptistries are much less common. This baptistry is especially educational because the bottom parts are Romanesque, begun around 1150, while the upper ones are Gothic, so you can see the two styles side by side, as it were. Here's the interior of this baptistry, and it has remarkable acoustics. The echoes last so long the guides can sing in harmony with themselves. Bononis of Pisa cast the 12th century bronze doors on the south transept of the Cathedral of Pisa, and they are the oldest bronze doors in Italy that are historiated, that is, decorated with scenes of human activity, though the ones we saw last quarter by Bernward of Hildesheim in Germany are nearly 200 years earlier than these. These doors by Bononis don't get as much respect as they deserve, and I don't think most tourists have any idea of their antiquity or importance. I'm not sure that we should call these works of genius, but I wouldn't jump up to oppose calling them that either. One thing that has to be understood about medieval art, as I emphasized last quarter, is the fact that medieval artists were more interested in reminding us in a memorable way that certain things happened than they were in showing us what they might have looked like when they happened. It has the sort of hieroglyphic quality which early Renaissance painting will have. But that said, I don't think that Bononis was in the same class as Ghiberti as a sculptor of this sort of thing. Here's a closer view of the Annunciation from the doors of Bononis. Charming as this work is in its way, I think that if Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise had been done in the 12th century in competition with those of Bononis here, and if you grant that that suggestion makes any sense, the jaws of the people would have dropped to their belts when they saw them, and Bononis would have been replaced on the spot. One thing that keeps us from seeing this as a work of genius, I think, actually, is just that it doesn't look as though it's that far above what we could do. When you look at Ghiberti's doors, whatever thoughts cross your mind, I could have done that, isn't going to be one of them. It takes only a glance to see that the sort of overall technique of the architect is in the 11th and 12th centuries, far in advance of the technique of the sculptor. As far as style goes, there's nothing, as I said, Roman about this sculpture to make it Romanesque. It is pretty much so solely by virtue of its date. Pretty much anything done in the period from, as I said, the 11th century to more or less through the 12th can be called Romanesque almost no matter what it looks like. Here's another close-up in which you can see the journey of the Magi at the bottom, and at the top what looks like a man stuck in a beehive, but that's Jesus being baptized in the River Jordan. Now in the Renaissance, it was commonly thought genius or talent or whatever was sort of like a commodity that could take any form. Julius II made Michelangelo paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, not because he was a great painter. He had, remember, never painted a fresco on commission in his life. He had him paint the ceiling. Julius had Michelangelo paint the ceiling because he was a genius. And the Pope was right in his choice. Michelangelo painted the greatest fresco ever on his first try. Similarly, I guess, people were impressed enough with Bononis' general ability that they made him the architect of the bell tower. And maybe they should have gotten someone else. I think Bononis may perhaps have been guilty of trying to save a few lira by not doing soil tests, or something like that. The Leaning Tower was begun about 1175, but began to lean north almost immediately, and work was stopped at the fourth level in 1178. In 1272, an attempt was made to finish the project, and the tower then began leaning back to the south, so work stopped again short of the belfry. Around 1360, the asymmetrical belfry was added in an attempt to tilt the tower back to the north, but by 1990 it was 17 feet out of line to the south, and the decision was made to close it to tourists. All sorts of ideas were proposed to solve the problem. The most memorable was the plan of the Italian-American Club to have a giant replica of the Statue of Liberty erected to buttress it. Here you see it from another angle now. In 1993, in a more prosaic mood, the authorities put lead weights in place against the base on the north side, and this was effective, but there was such an outcry over the ugly weights defacing the monument that another solution was demanded. And in 1999, then, it was decided to remove soil from under the north side to encourage a lean back that way, and this has apparently worked so well that the tower has now been reopened to the public as of June 2001. Even without its lean, which some like Edward Hutton think adds to its beauty, he says it makes it look like a lily in the wind or the horn of a unicorn, It would be famous as perhaps the most beautiful campanile in Italy, though it's far from the highest. Is it possible Bononis meant it to lean? If so, he created what is Pisa's greatest single source of modern prosperity, but I don't think we can give him credit for this. There are, in fact, a lot of leaning, if not so spectacularly leaning towers all over Italy. Okay, that's where we'll take the break. Load part B when you're ready.